You're welcome to the lecture Fundamentals of Web Programming. In this 6th chapter of Basics of Web Design, we will look at more CSS basics. Today's lecture on more CSS basics will equip you with learning outcomes such as how to describe and apply the CSS box model, how to configure width and height with CSS, how to configure margin, border, and padding with CSS, how to center web page content with CSS, how to apply shadows with CSS3, how to configure rounded corners with CSS3, how to configure background images with CSS3, and finally, how to configure opacity, RGBA colors, HSLA colors, and gradients with CSS3. Width and height with CSS. Looking at the slide, we have unit and purpose. In CSS, we have different types of units such as pixels, EM, percentage, VH, and VW. For pixels, it configures a fixed number of pixels as value. For the EM, it configures a value relative to the font size, and for the percentage, it configures a percentage value of the parent element. For VH, it configures a value relative to 1% of the viewport height. For VW, it configures a value relative to 1% of the viewport width. The CSS height and width properties are used to set the height and width of an element. The CSS max width property is used to set the maximum width of an element. The height and width properties do not include padding, borders, or margins. It sets the height and width of the area inside the padding, border, and margin of the element. Width and height properties. The width property is used to configure the width of an element's content. For the H1 instance, we have given the width 80%. Min width property is used to configure minimum width of an element. Max width property is used to configure the maximum width of an element, whereas the height property is used to configure the height of an element to the height, such as for H1, we have given 100 pixels to the height. The box model. In CSS, the term box model is used when talking about design and layout. The CSS box model is essentially a box that wraps around every HTML element. It consists of margins, borders, paddings, and actual content. The image on the slide illustrates the box model. Content are text and web page elements in the container. Padding are area between the content and the border. Border is between the padding and the margin, while margin determines the empty space between the element and adjacent elements. Configure margin with CSS. Let's look at the margin property and its related properties. We have margin top, margin right, margin left, and margin bottom. This configures empty space between the element and adjacent elements as shown in the syntax examples below. Configure padding with CSS. In this section, we'll examine the padding property and its related properties such as padding top, padding right, padding left, and padding bottom. This configures empty space between the content of the HTML elements such as text and the border as shown in the syntax examples below. The CSS border property configures a border on the top, right, bottom, and left side of an element. It consists of border width, border style, and border color. Here is an example of heading with border. For H2, for instance, we assign 2 pixels to the border, while for the solid color, we assigned #FF0000. Some of the valid border style values are default, non-inset, outset, double, groove, ridge, solid, dashed, and dotted border styles. Configuring specific sides of a border. Let's use CSS to configure a line on one or more sides of an element. In this, we're going to use the border bottom. Let's have a look at the example. We have for H2, we assign 2 pixels for the border bottom, while for the solid color, we assigned #FF0000. CSS rounded corners. To create a simple box with rounded corners, you simply need to add the border radius property to the box. The border radius property is a shorthand property that sets the radius for all 4 corners of the box to the same value when given only one value. For example, we assigned 1 pixel for the box H1 and a solid color of #000033 with a border radius of 15 pixels. In order to center a page content with CSS, you need to use a container element and set a specific maximum width. Many websites use a default width of 960 pixels, so remember to change the margin to also if you want to center a page. CSS box shadow property. The box shadow CSS property adds shadow effects around an element frame. You can set multiple effects separated by commas. A box shadow is described by X and Y offsets relative to the element, such as blur, spread radius, and color. If a border radius is specified on the element with the box shadow takes on the same rounded corners. More examples will be provided in the code. CSS text shadow property. The text shadow property adds shadow to text. This property accepts a comma-separated list of shadows to be applied to the text. More examples will be provided in the code. CSS background image properties. The background image property sets one or more background images for an element. By default, our background image is placed at the top left corner of an element and repeated both vertically and horizontally. For background image properties, more examples will be provided in the code. CSS opacity property. The properties of color are hue, saturation, brightness, and temperature. So what colors are hue? Hue appears in red, yellow, green, blue, or violet. Saturation, also known as intensity, refers to how much of a color there is, how rich, how intense, how much pigment versus how gray, also known as desaturated. Let's now dive into the code and examine some of the topics we've covered.